There are tons of ways to optimize your finances and get the most out of your money. Some simple, others quite complex. Today we're going to be talking about a fairly simple strategy that can help you get more out of your money, known as the 95% rule. I'll be discussing what it is, how to implement it yourself, as well as the pros and cons of using it in place of some other strategies we've discussed in previous videos. Let's get started. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a 30-day free trial of Audible and 2 free audiobooks of your choice, as well as a list of some books on money I'd recommend checking out with your free trial. The 95% rule was introduced by a man named Bob Clyatt in his book Work Less, Live More, and it serves as a potential alternative to the traditional 4% rule that we've discussed on this channel many times. For those who don't know, the traditional 4% rule has you withdraw 4% of a nest egg in the first year of retirement, or any withdrawal period, and then adjust that initial dollar amount that you withdrew for inflation in every subsequent year. The 95% rule is similar to that, but there are a couple of noteworthy differences. First, there are no adjustments for inflation with this method. And second, instead of withdrawing 4% of the initial portfolio in the first year of retirement, and then not caring what the portfolio's value is in any subsequent year, the 95% rule has you look at the value of your portfolio each and every year before making the withdrawal. This is because the amount you withdraw is based on a specific percentage of that value unless certain conditions are met, which means it's really more of a modified fixed percentage withdrawal strategy than it is a tweak to the original 4% rule. It's just that a lot of people use the 4% rule as their chosen fixed withdrawal percentage, so these strategies can sometimes get confused with that rule. The primary condition that we're concerned with is whether or not the portfolio's value has fallen over the course of the previous year. If it has, then we'll look at how much it's fallen by, and if it's fallen by enough, then the 95% rule will kick in. The 95% rule is built to ensure that your withdrawals will never fall by more than 5% from one year to the next, by allowing you to take 95% of the previous year's withdrawal amount if your nest egg has lost enough of its value that you would otherwise be withdrawing less. So let's put some numbers to it. Hypothetically, if you had a $1 million portfolio and you withdrew 4% of that in your first year, or $40,000, you'd have $960,000 left over. Then, let's say over the course of the following year, your investments fall in value by 20%. Now, you have a nest egg that's valued at $768,000 when you're about to make your next withdrawal. If you were simply to stick with a 4% withdrawal, as you would in a traditional fixed percentage withdrawal strategy, then you'd be pulling out roughly $30,720 for the year, which is a far cry from the withdrawal you had in your first year. This situation is exactly what the 95% rule is built to avoid. Since, in this hypothetical, your projected withdrawal for the second year fell by more than 5% from your prior year's withdrawal, down to $30,720 from $40,000, the 95% rule allows you to decrease your prior withdrawal by 5% and take that much from your nest egg this year. In this case, that would mean you'd withdraw $38,000, or roughly 4.95% of your remaining nest egg. And this pattern continues each and every year. You look at the value of your nest egg before making your withdrawal, multiply it by your chosen fixed withdrawal rate, and if that projected withdrawal is more than 5% below the withdrawal you made the previous year, you can instead opt to simply take 95% of that previous year's withdrawal. I should note that while a lot of people do use 4% for their withdrawal rate, it's not a hard and fast rule. You can go with some other rate if you want. Though obviously the higher that you go, the bigger the risk will be of you depleting your nest egg quicker than you'd want to, which can lead to you not having enough income to get by in later years. So that's the basic idea behind the 95% rule. It's fairly easy to implement once you get the hang of it. All you really need is the value of your nest egg, the amount you withdrew the previous year, and a calculator. Now let's go over some of the pros and cons of using this strategy as opposed to something like the traditional 4% rule. When it comes to comparing withdrawal strategies against one another, I like to take a look at what I call the 4 factors of retirement withdrawal strategies: income, risk, predictability or stability, and buying power. The income factor looks at the amount of money a withdrawal strategy generates for you, but gives extra credit to strategies that front load that income. In other words, strategies that tend to produce higher income levels in the early years of retirement when we're more likely to still be healthy and energetic enough to enjoy it. The risk factor looks at the likelihood of outliving your money based on the strategy that's being used. The lower the likelihood is of you outliving your money, the less risky the strategy is considered to be. The predictability or stability factor looks at how often the strategy leads to undesirable income changes. The changes can come in many forms, such as income freezes, forced reductions, caps on yearly income growth, and so on and so forth. The buying power factor looks at how your income changes relative to inflation. Strategies that increase your income directly in line with inflation, thus preserving your buying power over the years, are good. Strategies that regularly increase your income at a faster rate than inflation are even better. None of these 4 factors are inherently more important than the others. It all depends on what you're trying to accomplish given your own personal situation. For instance, someone retiring in their mid to late 70s might favor income over other factors, especially buying power, given that they likely won't need their nest egg to last them much more than a decade or two. Whereas someone retiring in their 30s may favor buying power much more strongly, given how much larger of a role inflation is likely to play for them. With that in mind, how does the 95% rule stack up compared to something like the 4% rule? As far as I can tell, the main pros that come to mind when thinking about the 95% rule in relation to the 4% rule is that in most cases it should produce a solid income, ensure that you don't experience major cuts to that income year to year, increase the relative buying power of your income over time, and make it extremely unlikely that you will outlive your money, assuming a reasonable initial safe withdrawal rate is chosen. So based on our 4 factors, it would, in most instances, score fairly well in terms of relative income generation and risk, and while there are certainly some caveats to keep in mind, especially in the short term, its buying power score would likely be above average in the long run. Its predictability would, unfortunately, be below average, though thanks to the 95% rule, it certainly would be better in this category than a standard fixed percentage withdrawal approach. The main drawbacks that come to mind when thinking about the 95% rule is that it can occasionally lose buying power, either due to fluctuations in investment returns or unusually high levels of inflation, lead to experiencing several successive years of, admittedly small, income cuts when markets experience prolonged recessions, drain its principal quickly if the chosen withdrawal rate is too aggressive or several years of bad returns are experienced, or both, and lose much of its income-related edge when paired with more conservative allocations due to lower long-term returns leading to less overall portfolio growth, which is crucial in this strategy as the value of the portfolio is the primary driver of income generation. So that's a bit to take in. Let's put some actual numbers to it to hopefully illustrate it better. So let's say that John had a $1 million nest egg invested in something like the S&P 500 in 1929, just before the onset of the Great Depression of the early 1930s. If he was retiring at that time and planned on utilizing the 95% rule for his withdrawal strategy, he wouldn't know it, but he'd be on the verge of experiencing 15 straight years of income cuts on a nominal basis from 1930 to 1945. Since inflation was falling during the early years of the Depression, it wouldn't have been quite that bad on an inflation-adjusted basis, but he still would have experienced decreases in his buying power in 13 of those 15 years. And the amounts weren't particularly small either. By 1945, he would have seen a decrease in his buying power of over 55%. In short, his standard of living would be less than half of what it was when he first retired. And his $1 million nest egg would have fallen to an inflation-adjusted low of $368,000 in 1942, before slowly starting to recover. Granted, that was the Great Depression, which is statistically the worst stock market crash of the past century, and we did have John investing in an all-stock portfolio. So this is an extreme example to illustrate the potential drawbacks when things go wrong, but that does at least give you an idea of how things can go sideways with this approach. Compare this to the traditional 4% rule over the same time period. All withdrawals are obviously adjusted for inflation with the 4% rule, so John's buying power would remain the same despite the market crash and the inflation of the early 1940s. He would have experienced a few income cuts in the years where inflation fell, at least on a nominal basis, but not nearly to the extent that we saw when using the 95% rule. His average income would have also been a fair bit higher during these years, roughly $35,000 a year with a minimum of just over $30,000, compared to the 95% rule's $28,000 a year average with a minimum of just under $18,000. Now, the trade-off to this is that the 95% rule allowed for a superior recovery once the Great Depression was finally over. In fact, by 1955, the nest egg under the 95% rule had returned to its $1 million mark when adjusted for inflation. The 4% rule would not have seen the same recovery. In fact, by 1957, the nest egg would have been completely gone. And that's a common trait of many fixed percentage withdrawal strategies. They tend to be less risky than some other approaches since the withdrawals are adjusted based on the value of the nest egg at the time. Therefore, your nest egg retains a bit more of its value by the time the market bottoms out and is usually able to recover better from the worst downturns. Assuming, of course, that you're able to get by during those lower income years. But not all withdrawal periods are like that. Over the last century, there's only ever been one Great Depression. discussion after all. So what happens if John had retired at a different point in time? Let's take a look at the last 30 years, for example. If John had retired in 1991 and used the traditional 4% rule, here's what his income figures and other metrics would have looked like. As you can see, even though the 4% rule would have left John with a substantially larger nest egg by 2021, it would have only generated a little over half the income of the 95% rule. Now that's what I call making the most out of your money. So those are the basics behind Bob Clyatt's 95% rule. It's basically a fixed percentage withdrawal strategy with a tweak that allows you to take 95% of the prior year's withdrawal should your investments take a nosedive. Overall, assuming you utilize a long-term growth-focused investing strategy that's well diversified, it tends to produce stronger income figures than the vanilla 4% rule does, even when using the same basic withdrawal rates. It also gives you the potential to grow that income faster than inflation if your investments perform well enough to outweigh the effects of inflation and your ongoing withdrawals. And assuming you are willing and able to be flexible with your budget and choose a safe enough initial withdrawal rate, there's a pretty good chance that your risk of outliving your savings will be even lower than it would be with the vanilla 4% rule. However, this does come at the cost of some income stability and potentially buying power, as you're likely going to have to cut your income year to year quite a bit more often than you would with the 4% rule, at least on an inflation-adjusted basis. And should we experience a prolonged and severe economic downturn, the cumulative costs of those income cuts could become quite substantial. In the worst cases, this could potentially be substantial enough that you're no longer able to meet your basic living costs on the income that the strategy would provide you with. At which point, you may have to temporarily deviate from the strategy to make ends meet and run the risk of outliving your savings, or find some other way to generate the income that you need until things recover. So what do you think of the 95% rule? Is it a viable alternative to the traditional 4% rule? Or would you prefer to follow the 4% rule in order to maintain your income stability and buying power, and then supplement it with other techniques like cash buffers, flexible spending budgets, and/or financial guardrails to mitigate the comparatively higher risks of outliving your savings? Let me know in the comments section below. But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. I generally upload every single Monday, and if you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.